Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Eureka Centre, and thanks for joining us on the first day of the Ballarat Heritage Festival for this very special event with Professor Marilyn Lake, AO. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that tonight we meet on the lands of the Wadawurrung people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be with us today or viewing this recording online. Really great to have Michaela Settle, MP, the member for Eureka, here with us today. Thanks for joining us, Michaela. Also, like to acknowledge that we've got many academics in the room, which is a testament to Professor Lake's reputation and influence. So we have Bridget Aitchison from the Australian Catholic University, and Bridget's the Ballarat Campus Dean, and Dr. Ben Mountford, also from ACU, and Anne Begg-Sunter from Federation University. Before I formally introduce Professor Lake, just a little bit of housekeeping. Please turn off your phones. Not really, because there's always one person. So please do that for us. We'd really appreciate it. There will be time for questions at the end of Professor Lake's talk. If you're up the back and you feel you need a microphone, just wave to me, I'll come up to you. If you feel you can throw your voice, that's good too. After the talk, there will be a book signing just out in the foyer. We have two books that are available to purchase from the gift shop. So go to the gift shop first, purchase the book you'd like Professor Lake to sign, and then go over to the table. We have Progressive New World, How Settler Colonialism and Trans-Pacific Exchange Shaped American Reform, a beautiful hardcover book from Harvard University Press, and that's Professor Lake's most recent book published in 2019, and also Freedom Bound: Two Documents of Women in Modern Australia, which Professor Lake co-edited with Katie Holmes. So I'll now formally introduce Professor Marilyn Lake. We're honoured to have you with us today, especially given that this is the start of the Ballarat Heritage Festival, and we'd like to start with something very special. And Professor Lake's talk tonight is Colonial Radicalism and Democratic Equality, and it explores the achievements of radical colonial reform in Victoria, culminating in the first compulsory wage in the world in 1896. The talk reflects her research in fields of Australian, American and transnational history, with a focus on the history of democracy and campaigns for sexual, racial and class equality. Professor Marilyn Lake, AO, is Professorial Fellow in History at the University of Melbourne. She has previously held chairs in history at La Trobe University, Stockholm University, the University of Maryland, and was the visiting chair in Australian Studies at Harvard University. Professor Lake has published many books, including Getting Equal, The History of Australian Feminism, and the aforementioned Progressive New World, her most recent book. In 2018, she was made an Officer of the Order of Australia for distinguished services to higher education, particularly to the social sciences as an academic, researcher and author, and through contributions to historical organisations. Please warmly welcome Professor Marilyn Lake.
Thank you very much for that lovely warm welcome, and thank you all for coming tonight. I have to take my glasses on and off. I'm not ever quite sure whether I need them. So it gives me great pleasure to be back here in Ballarat, and particular pleasure to speak to you this evening at this birthplace of colonial radicalism and democratic equality. The birthplace of one strand of colonial radicalism and one version of democratic equality. It was in this place that colonists saw the triumphant assertion of the rights of man, the assertion of the status of manhood and the fellowship of manhood in a colony founded by a British imperial power that had itself institutionalised class privilege hereditary and property rights, and aristocratic rule at home. This was then a radical political development in this colony, this new colony. Tonight, I want to salute the nature of that development and interrogate its limits. In his classic account of the Eureka Rebellion in the Golden Age, Jeff Searle, my erstwhile mentor at Monash University, where I did my PhD degree, wrote that, quote, Eureka gained the vote in practice for the diggers. Eureka, he said, was also extremely important in that it provided the occasion and the issues on which the democratic movement could build itself. The Age newspaper was correct, he noted, when it observed at the time that it is certain that the social compact is taking new shape. The most striking feature, said the Age, is the earnest and intrepid assertion common to all classes of their right to equal political privileges. That is, the demand for political equality, the demand for recognition of the equality of man. Similar radical demands were being made in other colonies, especially New South Wales, where a young colonial-born Republican poet and orator called Daniel Dennehy imagined a new world being born in the southern seas, and he ridiculed the efforts of a local patrician class in New South Wales, Botany Bay Magnificos, he called them, their efforts to recreate what he called a bunyip aristocracy. This was a new age, he objected, an age when, quote, glorious manhood asserted its elevation. So it was no longer titles or education or property or rank or religion that mattered, he averred, but manhood, being a man. This was not just an egalitarian claim then to equality, it was also a gendered claim. Manhood perhaps asserted its elevation with more confidence and success in Victoria than in longer settled New South Wales. In Victoria, wrote historian Alan Atkinson, there was no settled society, no assumptions based on local custom, as in New South Wales. Men mattered less here for their background and connections. In Victoria, wrote colonial observer William Westgarth, meetings were a common stage, knowing no monopoly, where individuals of all ranks freely give views on public affairs. The introduction of manhood suffrage in Victoria in 1857, though hedged about with all sorts of qualifications, nevertheless symbolised the elevation of glorious manhood to political power. Manhood thus came to signify power. This development shocked observers in the mother country who decried what they thought was the advent of mob rule. Because in Britain, by contrast, men didn't win manhood suffrage until the end of World War I, some 60 years later. And thus, they were conscripted in World War I to fight in the trenches before they could vote. In Australia, by contrast, conscription to fight in World War I was put to the democratic vote twice, in 1916 and 1917, and was defeated both times. During those campaigns, Prime Minister Billy Hughes expressed his fear that the women's vote, because women had been enfranchised federally in 1902, the women's vote, he feared, would jeopardise his desired outcome, that is conscription, because women, he said, were ruled by their attachments to family. They would vote to keep their sons and brothers and husbands at home. Hughes warned, outrageously I think, that women's citizenship was in fact on probation. Could they be trusted in the national interest? I'll return to this issue, the implications of women's familial difference for their common citizenship, later in the lecture. In the decades that followed the democratic reforms of the 1850s, Victoria became known as the most radical, democratic, progressive colony. Australia's Massachusetts, as leading Victorian Liberal Charles Pearson would say. Pearson, who was a great admirer of the United States, was an English-born historian, journalist, politician and writer, and I'll return to his influence on colonial democracy again a bit later. The reforms achieved in Victoria included the secret ballot, the 8-hour day, land reforms, payment of members of parliament, free, compulsory and secular education, the state ownership of railways and utilities, workers' compensation, the abolition of child labour, immigration restriction, the first legal minimum wage in the world, which was in Victoria in 1896, and wages boards on which employers and workers were equally represented, inaugurating an order dubbed economic democracy by American observers and labelled state socialism by Victorian contemporaries. In Pearson's influential work, National Life and Character, a Forecast, published in 1893 by Macmillan in London and New York, which was reviewed and recommended by future US President Theodore Roosevelt, among many others. Pearson, the former member of the Victorian Legislative Assembly for the Goldfields seat of Castlemaine, explained state socialism to his readers. He said, state employees are an important element of the population. The state builds railways, founds and maintains schools, tries to regulate the wages and hours of labour, protects native industry, settles the population on the land, and is beginning to organise systems of state insurance. State socialism had succeeded, Pearson wrote, because it is all-embracing and able to compel obedience. It was superior to European forms of welfare or social insurance, he suggested, because it had been developed by the community for their own needs and not by state departments, and he was referring here to Bismarck's Germany, not by state departments for administrative purposes. State payments of welfare measures, this was an important innovation, came in Victoria and then Australia from general revenue. You didn't have to put in to get out. The democratic origins of colonial innovation were also emphasised by American commentators who travelled to Australia in large numbers to see these experiments for themselves. I discussed these visitors in my most recent book, just referred to before, which you can buy in the bookshop, the book called Progressive New World, How Settler Colonialism and Trans-Pacific Exchange Shaped American Reform. These visitors included the single taxer Henry George, social commentator Frank Parsons, Californian investigator Harris Weinstock, Stanford professor David Starr Jordan, Ohio State professor M.B. Hammond, who came here for a full sabbatical leave, Wisconsin professor Richard Ely, the Boston feminists Maud Wood Park and Mabel Willard, the suffragist Marin B. Fenwick, and WCTU leader Jesse Ackerman, and the radical journalist, the muckraking journalist Henry Demarest Lloyd. In a democracy, wrote Lloyd in his book Newest England, in self-government, he said, state help is self-help. Australian democracy was so successful and progressive, he wrote, and he told an Adelaide audience, that Americans could make a study of it and reap an advantage, and so they did. More visitors arrived after the inauguration of the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901. The name Commonwealth, and I'll come back to that itself, a progressive gesture on the part of the Federal Fathers, who invoked the American, that is republic, as in being a republic, examples of the Commonwealths of Massachusetts and Virginia. Commonwealth legislation during the years before World War I, these formative years, confirmed Australia's reputation for democratic innovation, with the introduction of women's suffrage and the right to stand for Parliament in 1902, the creation of a federal arbitration court, and in 1907, the Harvester Judgment that institutionalised a living wage, which was based on the radical principle, still radical, that wages should be calculated according to human needs, not employers' profits or productivity. There were also old age and invalid pensions, and in 1912, a maternity allowance paid to citizen mothers, as Prime Minister Andrew Fisher said, citizen mothers after childbirth, extending in a radical move to unmarried mothers. This was in part because of the lobbying of Labor women, but not to non-white mothers. In this new world democracy, citizenship was understood as a racialised condition, theorised as the right to and capacity for self-government, the self-government of white men and subsequently white women. In Progressive New World, I showed how influential the Australian Progressive Program, much of it originating in Victoria, was to the rest of the world, and in particular to American progressives, because they identified with their fellow white settler colonists across the Pacific. And they shared a sense of themselves as pioneers in building new worlds, new world pioneers. An early convert to the idea of state socialism was President Theodore Roosevelt, who, as I noted earlier, had read and reviewed Pearson's National Life and Character in the 1990s, and he had recommended it widely to all of his influential friends in Washington. He would later discuss progressive ideas with the young Victorian suffragist Vida Goldstein, whom he met in Washington in 1902 when she was the Australasian delegate to the first Universal Suffrage Conference in Washington. Many Australian feminists travelled to the US to spread the message about Australia's advanced reforms. Catherine Helen Spence, Maybank Anderson, Vida Goldstein, Alice Henry, Miles Franklin, the latter of whom, the two latter, Henry and Miles Franklin, worked with the National Women's Trade Union League in Chicago. Roosevelt served as President of the United States from 1901 to 1908, but he stood again as a presidential candidate for the Progressive Party in 1912. His platform included a living wage, shorter hours, protective tariffs, the abolition of child labour, workers' compensation, and women's suffrage. We stand for a living wage, he declared. We favour women's suffrage. Described by admirers as one of the boldest visions in the history of mainstream American politics, Roosevelt's program was yet scorned by conservatives as just a rehash of policies long in vogue in Australia and New Zealand, a mere imitation of Australasian radicalism, indeed of Victorian radicalism. In his assessment of the historical significance of Eureka and the Diggers movement, Jeff Searle noted that they articulated issues that would become important to the broader democratic movement. A key issue, of course, was land reform, spurred on by the hunger for land, which for English working men promised the ever-elusive manly independence and freedom from wage slavery. In England, where the long process of enclosure was almost over and anything resembling a peasantry had been eliminated, politics was animated by a hunger for land, which could only be satisfied by emigration, often to North America, to the United States and Canada, and Australasia. One of the most insistent political demands then in the Australian colonies was for governments to open up the lands, to challenge the domination of the squatters, and to make land available to all. In other words, to enable white men to become settler colonists. Selection Acts were passed across the colonies in the 19th century, and later schemes for closer settlement and soldier settlement continued the process right through into the 1920s, as I showed in my book on soldier settlement, Victorian soldier settlement, called The Limits of Hope. Thus, the central tragedy of Victorian and Australian history unfolded. The progressive democratic order of the New World, with its generous promise and radical innovation, rested squarely on the dispossession and destruction of Indigenous peoples. The one rested on the other. Radical Democrats were philosophical evolutionists. They believed in evolution, who believed in progress, hence the term progressive. And they regularly juxtaposed the advanced, as they called it, the advanced new political and economic world that they were building in the Australasian colonies with the backward, in quotes, primitive worlds they were displacing. Colonial radical Democrats cast themselves as progressive in what I've called a temporal construction of double difference. They distinguish themselves both from old world feudalism on the one hand and Stone Age savagery on the other. So there was a sense of double temporal difference. Hence, for example, to give an example, when the American trade unionist Sam Gompers praised Victorian unionists for inaugurating the 8-hour day, he declared, quote, "The gloom of the effete monarchical and feudal institutions was lifted and the darkness of ages ended." This was the great light that the 8-hour day brought about. And note there the use of the term effete there, the way that monarchical and feudal institutions were characterised as effete, that is, not manly, not masculine. So it was that a radical colonial settler democracy shaped, as Pearson wrote, by memories of class rule. They brought with them memories of class rule from Britain. And he said, intolerable wrong in the old country, and shaped by intense land hunger in the new, so it was that these memories and desires drove what the late Patrick Wolfe called memorably the elimination of the native. In this scenario, native peoples were cast as a dying race, or as evanescent races, in Pearson's words, in National Life and Character, who, he said, died out as we approached. It's a rather passive process. A convenient conceit based on historical denial and willful repression. Progressive Democrats understood their vision of a new world in terms of a series of binaries, not just advanced and backward, but also civilized and primitive, white and Asiatic, beef-eating men and rice-eating men, manhood and womanhood. These binaries structured their understanding of the world and their politics. In the insistent demand for labour reform, for example, for decent wages, conditions and shorter hours, its champions, both Labor and Liberal leaders such as Pearson, Alfred Deakin from 1901, you will know the member for Ballarat, and H.B. Higgins, they often invoked the spectre of the Asiatic coolie, Asiatic being a new term deployed here, the Asiatic coolie, the docile, subservient, exploited, indentured Asiatic labourer, who by then was widely employed, in fact, by the British Empire, by the expanding British Empire, in their domains across Southeast Asia, Fiji, for example, and Northern Australia. As Alan Atkinson put it, the coolie was democracy's antitype. The Progressive Democratic Reform platform included immigration restriction, for in their view, equality demanded exclusion. But the racial restrictions hardened as the 19th century went on. In Victoria, manhood suffrage had initially extended to include Aboriginal and Chinese men in the 1850s, because it was their manhood that had been the only qualification. But racial anxieties grew as the century advanced and as the world became more interconnected, with the great modern migrations of the British and Chinese empires in the 19th century, bringing previously separate peoples into close contact, especially on the Australian continent. Historic encounters, as Ben Mountford, May Nye and others have shown. In 1881, the Victorian government introduced legislation to disenfranchise Chinese Australian men. They'd enjoyed the franchise until then. The Liberal Age newspaper and its proprietor David Syme, as well as leading radical Democrats such as Higginbotham and Pearson, were all keen supporters of this legislation to disenfranchise Chinese Australian men. By 1881, one of the most common arguments used to justify immigration restriction was the recently recorded census statistic. The census was a new technology, the 19th century, that told the world of China's vast population. 400 million people at that point. Just think of it, it's huge. Quote, the largest population of any country in the world, as alarmists frequently said. A fact that, interestingly, Chinese Australians had themselves helped publicise in booklets such as The Chinese Question in Australia, published in Melbourne by Lo Kong Meng and his co-authors in 1878. Charles Pearson was one of their readers, their many readers, and was eloquent in warning about the prospect of the white population, as he put it, and you start increasingly to see the use of that term, the white population, being swamped, as he put it, by Chinese hordes. And he introduces a trope that would echo down the ages, of course, the Chinese hordes. He said, he's talking to the Legislative Assembly here in supporting the legislation to disenfranchise Chinese Australian men. He said the population of China was nearly 400 million. And the mere natural increase of that population in a single year would be sufficient to swamp the whole white population of the colony. Australia was now perfectly known to the Chinese, he said. Communication between the two countries was thoroughly established, and in the event of famine or war arising in China, Chinamen might come here at any time in hordes. As we know, when the first federal parliament met in 1901, it too passed immigration restriction legislation. But it's often forgotten that the White Australia policy actually comprised 3 pieces of legislation. The Immigration Restriction Act, legislation to deport Pacific Island labourers, and also the formal acquisition of New Guinea from the UK as an Australian colony. So at the same time as the new Australian nation state puts up the Great White Walls, Australia also became a colonial power in the Pacific. I think that's significant. Our first Prime Minister was, as you will all know, Edmund Barton, and when he rose in the first Parliament to support the new policy, the White Australia policy in general, he held aloft a copy of Pearson's book, National Life and Character. He held it up as he made his speech supporting this policy to warn about Chinese global power. And in some ways, Pearson's book, I think, can be seen as one of Australia's founding documents, one of its constitutive texts. Barton quoted Pearson's warning that, quote, "The day will come when the European observer will wake to find the black and yellow races no longer under tutelage, but forming independent governments, in control of their own trade and industry, invited to international conferences, and welcomed as allies in the civilised world. White men," Pearson had written, and Barton is reading this out in the Federal Parliament in 1901, "white men would find themselves elbowed and hustled, and perhaps even thrust aside." I think that's such an interesting physical image. When that day came, Pearson suggested, the white man's pride of place, it's a wonderful phrase, the white man's pride of place in the world would be humiliated. This preoccupation with pride of place vis-a-vis China, the global power of China, has unfortunately been resurrected in recent times in discussions about AUKUS, I think. Indeed, the Age newspaper, when announcing AUKUS, you probably might remember this, had on its very front page a vivid graphic image of a whole lot of red jet fighters coming from China, headed our way. It was a sort of replica of the Chinese hordes, only more scary. Pearson, in fact, we can now see, proved prescient when he warned that China would become a great power in the world. That was the phrase. And I think the White Australia policy is often misunderstood in that people often don't realise that it was an outer-directed policy. It was centrally concerned with global historical politics. Pearson had written, "With civilisation equally diffused, the most populous country must ultimately be the most powerful. And the preponderance of China over any rival, even over the United States of America, is likely," he said, "to be overwhelming. The future," he said, "would see China take its inevitable position as one of the great powers of the world." A fact we still, I think, have difficulty coming to terms with. Now, Pearson was a champion of the rights of manhood, but he was also, like fellow radical Democrats, a committed feminist. He had long been a supporter of women's entry to higher education and the professions and suffrage. But advocacy of women's political equality posed a dilemma for Democrats and feminists. Should women claim the vote on the basis of their common humanity and shared citizenship, or on the basis of their difference? That is, their different life experiences, needs, perspectives, values, and oppressions. Differences that animated their desire to bring what they called a new element into political life. When you research Australian women's political history over the last 140 years, you will find clear and continuing patterns in the political demands made by women and their numerous organisations. The two most explicit, long-lasting and intertwined of women's political goals have been to achieve the economic independence of women and the protection of women and children from men's violence. Feminists have long believed that the former was necessary to achieving the latter. In the 19th century, this was made very explicit. Louisa Lawson, editor of the feminist paper, Dawn, considered marital abuse so common, this is in the 1880s, 1890s, so common, she likened the bedroom to what she called a chamber of horrors. Like Lawson, Rose Scott also received many letters from women detailing their daily degradation and fear. One correspondent, for example, and you have all of these letters in the case of Rose Scott in her papers in the Mitchell Library, one correspondent called Florence Roberts, for example, wrote about her conjugal misery as follows. She said, "He simply would have me be his slave and not his wife. He said he would make me obey him. He would make me do just what he chose or murder me. He would teach me who he was," which is an interesting phrase, isn't it? It makes you wonder who he thought he was. And I assume he thought he was a man, and he was a man with conjugal rights. In a lecture in 1903 called The Economic Independence of the Married Woman, Rose Scott emphasised the moral and psychological effects on wives of men's enforcement of their conjugal rights. How much degradation and insult, she wrote, even unintentional, may a woman have to endure because economically she is dependent on her husband. Increasingly, men's conjugal rights were asserted and they were guaranteed in law in Australia in this radical democratic society until the 1980s, not long ago. Men's democratic rights then included conjugal rights. Women, of course, had no conjugal rights. Conjugal rights were rights over women. Lawson and Scott knew that women needed the means to escape and to live independently. Not all women, however, were free to enter the paid workforce, as today. Domestic responsibilities tied them to the home. So women often argued for state support, for payments to mothers, so they could continue to care for their children while they lived apart from their husbands. In the Australian colonies and in the Australian Commonwealth, single women had received state support intermittently from the 1890s. First of all, in the form of what were called boarding out allowances and then supporting benefits. But what of married women? What would they do? In 1927, at a Royal Commission into Child and Motherhood Endowment, which was one of the biggest planks of feminists then, the feminist demand for motherhood endowment, a payment from the state, led to the following exchange, which I shall share with you. When an astonished male Royal Commissioner asked feminist witness Irene Longman about her advanced theory, and it's interesting how he uses that term theory, that she had a theory. He said, "Your theory is that the state should pay the wife for services rendered to the state." And she said, "Yes, we say that her services to the state are as great as those of the man, and therefore that those services should be paid as an independent economic unit." And again, you get that phrase, an independent economic unit. To which the clearly puzzled Royal Commissioner replied, "Women could live apart from their husbands." "That is an alteration of existing conditions," he asked. "Yes," said Longman. "Yes, absolutely," she replied. "It is revolutionary, and that is what we wish." Well, women, of course, await the revolution still. After around 170 years of manhood suffrage and some 140 years of Australian women's activism, the goal of equal citizenship still seems elusive. Certainly, we have our second woman premier, and half the federal cabinet are female. But women in general remain vulnerable to daily violence, increasing rates of murder. They remain exploited in unpaid or poorly paid work, and they work longer hours than men. Women remain the weary sex, as William Lane, in William Lane's evocative description in his 19th century novel, A Working Man's Paradise. William Lane wrote this great novel, A Working Man's Paradise, which picks up on all those themes of the achievements of manhood suffrage, but he calls women the weary sex. I think it's a great description. Today, the gender pay gap remains, of course, hovering between 13 and 19% during the last 2 decades. Unequal pay is exacerbated by women's greater preponderance in part-time work. And women are much more likely to be in part-time, insecure and casual jobs, in part because they comprise the majority of care workers. Care workers at home, unpaid, but also in aged care, hospital care, in NDIS, childcare, after-school care. Furthermore, as a result of the history of unequal pay, the median super balance for men is 24% more than for women. Unlike earlier welfare measures, such as the maternity allowance I mentioned before, or unemployment benefits, superannuation was conceived as a work-based contribution, and it's interesting in that way. Paul Keating's great superannuation was a work-based contribution. And so it was bound in its very design to benefit men with higher pay packets more than women. But having said that, look at the miserly sums paid now to those on JobSeeker. So state socialism doesn't work so well anymore in these neoliberal times. Historically, women's poverty and vulnerability to violence have been interrelated. Because of their responsibility for care work, many women are economically dependent on men, especially women with children. They are thus especially vulnerable to coercion and violence. If they leave abusive partners, they are likely to live in poverty, or they may be killed. As we've been hearing recently, one woman is murdered by a partner or former partner every few days in Australia. Almost 10 women a day are hospitalised for assault injuries perpetrated by a spouse or domestic partner. These vulnerabilities are much worse for trans women and women with disabilities, and much worse for Indigenous women. In 2018 to 19, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women had 29 times the rate of hospitalisation for non-fatal family violence assaults compared with non-Indigenous women. So, I'm coming to my conclusion. In the 1850s, manhood was triumphant, but it also became rampant, I suggest. He demanded I obey him, said Florence Roberts, which necessitated in turn the mobilisation of womanhood, the woman movement, and the demand for the power of the ballot. Feminist activism was often a response to men's violence. The mobilisation continues. We hear new calls to close the gender pay gap and better support for single mothers. And there are increasing demands that we better train girls and boys in schools for the responsibilities and challenges of equal citizenship. Citizenship, the great glory of citizenship, is it denotes equal status, a status of equality. Many years ago, in the middle of one of our recurring domestic violence crises, this time in the 1990s, I wrote an op-ed for the Age newspaper, which was titled, "On the Defensive, It's the Right of Every Woman." in which I argued that citizenship training in schools should include lessons in self-defence for girls and in conversational skills for boys. Such classes now seem more necessary than ever, with boys and young men increasingly, it seems, living in an enclosed online world where they're instructed in misogyny and pornography and incited to follow the example of Andrew Tate and his acolytes. In the 19th century, the project of reforming masculinity was central to the woman movement. Leaders such as Louisa Lawson and Rose Scott deplored the fact that boys were taught, they said, by public opinion that it was manly, quote, to drink, gamble and be immoral, encouraging immorality in others. Sadly, observed Lawson of the Australian Boy, she wrote, to be able to smoke, swear, drink and gamble like a man is the alpha and omega of his infantile dreams. Boys and young men, feminists said, needed better models of manhood. Feminists then were necessarily in the front ranks of the battle against intemperance, gambling, cruelty, sexual violence. And as today, consent was a key issue. There are renewed calls for changes in the culture of masculinity today. And it's interesting, just today, this very day, I was looking at The Age and there's a wonderful long letter by a man about the terrible model of masculinity he was instructed in. And then a great article in The Guardian about how, men needed to change. So this is, again, a big issue. And it's interesting, isn't it? It's a big issue in the 1880s and 1890s. It's a big issue in the 2020s. Some have argued, however, that education and training are not effective on their own. You need more, that men should be subject to penalties. They should be appropriately punished for violence against women, not just through the legal system, but also with loss of their citizenship, that symbol of equal status. And so we come full circle. We began by looking at men's achievement of citizenship rights that some now suggest should be forfeited when men harm their fellow women citizens. In a submission to a national summit on domestic violence in the 1980s, the historian Judith Allen said, quote, for a start, she said, violent men should be disenfranchised and lose citizenship rights. Interestingly, she added that this was an achievement of Queensland women in 1905. Isn't that interesting? When a law was passed to disenfranchise wife batterers. But she said then their citizenship was later restored. Violent men, she said, should lose citizenship. They should be unable to work in the professions. They should not be able to be members of trade unions or sporting associations or recreational clubs or religious organisations if they are proven wife batterers. Moreover, custody of children should be denied them. Judith Allen finished this submission and her speech by saying that if all this seems utopian, that they would lose their citizenship, be denied the professions, if all this seems utopian, she said, it tells us how masculinist our world still is. So to conclude, in the 1850s, Daniel Dennehy celebrated glorious manhood's elevation. Now, elevation is one thing, but equality is quite another. I finish tonight with the question of whether glorious manhood is ready now to forego the elevation promised in the 1850s in favour of meeting the harder challenge of true equality. We need to challenge understandings of manhood as exercising power over others. Manhood as constituted in power relations. So finally, I end with some more questions. Can white men forego their pride of place? That's also about power over others. Can white men forego their pride of place in the world and avoid making war in the Pacific? Can Indigenous peoples, not evanescent after all, we know, but proud survivors, be accorded an equality of voice? Can the well-off share their wealth through more progressive taxation so that we in Australia might come closer to realising the true meaning of commonwealth, a commonwealth, as envisaged by our federal fathers? And finally, can men celebrate the elevation of women alongside men and not see women's advancement as their loss, and thus come to share the emancipation of true democratic equality? Thank you.